In the spring of the year 535, on a small island surrounded by the dark waters of Lake Vulsina in central Italy, a queen waited inside a guarded fortress. Only months earlier, Amalasuntha had ruled the Ostrogothic Kingdom, a realm stretching across Italy and shaped by the legacy of her father, Theodoric the Great. She had received ambassadors, issued royal commands, negotiated with emperors, and attempted to preserve one of the most powerful states created after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. Now she had no court, no army, and no freedom. The man she had raised beside herself as king had betrayed her, removed her supporters, and sent her away from the capital. Guards controlled the island. Every boat crossing the water could be watched. Every message could be intercepted. Amalasuntha knew that her life depended on decisions being made far from her prison, in the royal court of Ravenna and in the imperial palace at Constantinople. Then men arrived at the fortress. Ancient accounts disagree about every detail of what followed, but they agree on the result. Amalasuntha was murdered. One writer says she was strangled while bathing. Another says that enemies seeking revenge were allowed to remove and kill her. The exact scene remains uncertain, but the political meaning was unmistakable. Theodahad, the cousin she had made king, had allowed the queen to be destroyed. Her death ended the last serious challenge to his authority inside the Gothic kingdom. Yet instead of securing his throne, the murder gave the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian a powerful justification for war. Within months, imperial forces entered Ostrogothic territory. What began as a palace betrayal would help ignite a conflict that lasted nearly 20 years, devastated Italy, destroyed the Ostrogothic kingdom, and transformed the political future of the Mediterranean. The murder of Amalasuntha was therefore more than the death of one queen. It was the point at which a private struggle for power became an international crisis. It involved royal succession, ethnic identity, revenge, diplomacy, gender, and imperial ambition. Who truly wanted Amalasuntha dead? Was Theodahad the mastermind, or a weak ruler pressured by powerful families? Did the Empress Theodora secretly encourage the crime, as one hostile source later claimed? And when Justinian sent his army into Italy, was he avenging an ally defending Roman legitimacy, or simply using a murdered queen as the perfect excuse for a conquest he already desired? To understand the final hours on that island, we must return to the world Amalasuntha inherited, a kingdom built by a warrior king over the ruins of Roman power. In 476, the young emperor Romulus Augustulus was removed from the Western imperial throne by the military leader Odoacer. Later generations would remember this event as the fall of the Western Roman Empire, but life in Italy did not suddenly become unrecognizable. Roman law, taxation, senatorial families, urban institutions, and imperial habits survived. Odoacer ruled Italy as king while formally acknowledging the authority of the emperor in Constantinople. This arrangement was unstable. The Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno eventually encouraged Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths, to invade Italy and remove Odoacer. Theodoric had spent part of his youth in Constantinople, where he learned the language of imperial politics as well as the methods of war. He led his people westward, crossed into Italy, defeated Odoacer's armies, and trapped his rival in Ravenna. After a prolonged struggle, the two rulers agreed to share power. The agreement did not last. At a banquet in 493, Theodoric personally killed Odoacer. The murder announced a new political order. Theodoric now controlled Italy, yet he did not rule as a destroyer of everything Roman. He preserved much of the existing administration and relied on experienced Roman officials. Gothic warriors formed the military foundation of the kingdom, while Roman elites continued to manage law, finance, and civil government. Theodoric presented himself as a protector of Italy, a ruler who could combine Gothic strength with Roman order. He maintained relations with the Eastern Emperor, though the exact legal nature of his authority remained deliberately ambiguous. To the Goths, he was their king. To Roman subjects, he could appear as the guardian of a familiar political system. To Constantinople, he was both useful and dangerous, a ruler who controlled imperial territory while claiming a degree of legitimacy from the empire itself. Theodoric's achievement depended heavily on his personal authority. He had the military reputation to command Gothic nobles and the political intelligence to reassure Roman senators. He could balance religious differences as well. The Ostrogoths followed Arian Christianity, while most Romans in Italy belonged to the Nicene tradition accepted by Constantinople. These divisions could become dangerous, but Theodoric generally tried to prevent them from destroying the kingdom. The result was not perfect harmony. Tensions remained between Goths and Romans, soldiers and civilians, Arians and Nicenes, royal officials and senatorial families. But under Theodoric, the system survived. Ravenna became the center of royal government. Magnificent churches and palaces displayed the king's ambition. Italy experienced relative stability after decades of conflict. The question that no one could avoid was what would happen when Theodoric died. His kingdom was built around a warrior king. His direct male heirs were limited. His daughter Amalasuntha would become essential to the future of the dynasty. Amalasuntha was born into the Amal royal house, one of the most prestigious dynasties among the Goths. Her father was Theodoric. Her mother, Audafleda, was connected to the powerful Frankish ruler Clovis. From childhood, Amalasuntha stood at the center of a network of royal marriages and political expectations. Ancient writers describe her as highly educated, intelligent, and able to speak several languages. She was comfortable with Roman literature and administration. She could communicate with senators, diplomats, and imperial officials in ways that distinguished her from many members of the Gothic military aristocracy. Her education was not merely a private accomplishment. It shaped her entire political identity. Amalasuntha believed that the Ostrogothic monarchy could survive by continuing her father's balance between Gothic military power and Roman civil culture. She did not see Roman learning as weakness. She saw it as an instrument of rule. A king governing Italy needed to understand law, rhetoric, diplomacy, and administration. The population of the kingdom was overwhelmingly Roman in language, legal tradition, and civic life. A ruler who ignored that reality would govern only the army and lose the country. Amalasuntha married Athalaric, a Gothic noble whose royal ancestry strengthened the legitimacy of Theodoric's line. The marriage produced children, including a son named Athalaric. Athalaric, however, died before Theodoric. His death removed the adult male who might have succeeded the old king. Athalaric became the central hope of the dynasty, but he was still a child. When Theodoric died in 526, the boy inherited the throne at approximately 10 years of age. Officially, Athalaric was king. In practice, Amalasuntha ruled as regent. Her authority came through her son, her father's legacy, and her own political ability. This arrangement was both powerful and fragile. As long as Athalaric lived, Amalasuntha could present herself as the guardian of the legitimate king, if he died. Before reaching maturity, her legal position would become uncertain. Gothic nobles who accepted a mother ruling for a boy might resist a woman ruling in her own right. Amalasuntha therefore had to protect not only the kingdom, but also her son's health, education, reputation, and loyalty. Every decision concerning the young king became a political decision concerning her own survival. During the early years of the regency, Amalasuntha attempted to continue the administrative traditions of Theodoric. Roman officials remained important. Among them was Cassiodorus, a skilled administrator and writer whose surviving letters preserve the formal language of the Gothic court. These documents present the monarchy as lawful, orderly, and committed to justice. They praise cooperation between Goths and Romans and describe the royal government as the guardian of Italy. Such letters were political instruments. They did not reveal every conflict inside the palace, but they show how Amalasuntha wanted her rule to appear: stable, Roman in administration, Gothic in legitimacy, and respectful of established institutions. She also maintained contact with Constantinople. The Eastern Roman Empire remained the strongest power in the Mediterranean, and its recognition mattered. Amalasuntha understood that friendly relations with the emperor could deter enemies at home, yet dependence on Constantinople could also create suspicion among Gothic nobles. Some feared that the queen admired Roman culture too deeply and might sacrifice Gothic independence. The most visible conflict centered on Athalaric's education. Amalasuntha wanted her son trained in literature, law, rhetoric, and the disciplines associated with Roman aristocratic leadership. She placed him under learned teachers and attempted to shape him into a ruler capable of governing both Goths and Romans. To her, this was the only sensible future for the kingdom. To some Gothic nobles, it looked like cultural surrender. They argued that a king should grow among warriors, learn courage through hardship, ride, hunt, command men, and prepare for battle. Books, strict tutors, and Roman manners would make him weak. The disagreement was not simply about how a boy should spend his days. It was a struggle over the identity of the Ostrogothic monarchy. Would the next king continue Theodoric's political fusion, becoming a ruler familiar with Roman civilization? Or would he represent a more openly Gothic warrior tradition? Because Amalasuntha controlled access to Athalaric, the nobles also feared that she was using education to keep him dependent on her. A well-trained adult king might eventually rule independently, but a child, surrounded by his mother's officials, ensured that she remained the true center of power. The pressure grew until Amalasuntha was forced to compromise. Gothic nobles gained greater influence over Athalaric's upbringing. Young companions were placed around him. Procopius, an Eastern Roman historian who later wrote about these events, claims that the boy was encouraged toward drinking and reckless behavior. Ancient historians often explained political failure through moral decline, and the details may be exaggerated. Yet the larger point is believable. Amalasuntha lost control over her son's environment. Athalaric became less responsive to her authority, and his health deteriorated. The young king, whose life supported the entire regency, was increasingly unable to provide stability. At the same time, powerful men plotted against Amalasuntha. She faced a brutal political reality. If she appeared weak, her enemies might remove or kill her. If she acted forcefully, she risked creating blood feuds among the Gothic aristocracy. She chose force. 3 prominent Gothic nobles who opposed her were removed and eventually killed. The surviving sources describe them as conspirators, though we cannot know every detail of their plans. From Amalasuntha's perspective, the executions may have been necessary acts of survival. They eliminated immediate threats and demonstrated that the queen could punish disloyalty. But aristocratic politics did not end with the death of an enemy. Families remembered, relatives inherited anger, supporters waited for a chance to reverse the judgment. The executions created a faction that would later play a direct role in Amalasuntha's destruction. Her position became increasingly dependent on external support. She sent signals to Constantinople and considered what might happen if she were forced to flee. Procopius suggests that she prepared the possibility of escaping to the Eastern Empire. Whether every detail of his story is accurate or not, the logic is clear. Amalasuntha needed a refuge and an ally beyond Italy. The Emperor Justinian could provide both. Yet communication with Constantinople was dangerous. To her enemies, it could appear that she was preparing to hand the kingdom to the Romans. The more she sought protection from the empire, the more Gothic opponents could accuse her of disloyalty. She was trapped between domestic danger and foreign dependence. Every measure taken to preserve her position gave her enemies another reason to distrust her. Athalaric's illness continued, and in October 534, he died. He was still young. His death changed everything. Amalasuntha had ruled for years, but officially she had ruled as the mother and regent of a legitimate male king. Without Athalaric, the legal foundation beneath her authority weakened. She remained the daughter of Theodoric and the most experienced figure in the royal government, but many Gothic nobles were unlikely to accept her as sole monarch. She needed an adult male partner from the Amal dynasty, someone whose blood could satisfy aristocratic expectations while leaving real power in her hands. She chose her cousin, Theodahad. The decision would destroy her. Theodahad was not an unknown outsider. He belonged to the royal family and had received an education influenced by Roman learning. He owned extensive estates, especially in Tuscany, and was familiar with elite culture. On paper, he appeared suitable. He had the ancestry required by the Goths, and the education valued by Amalasuntha. Yet his reputation was deeply troubling. Sources portray him as greedy, obsessed with land, and willing to pressure or seize property from others. Amalasuntha had previously opposed some of his actions and forced him to surrender estates obtained through questionable means. He had reasons to resent her authority. She nevertheless believed that she could control him. Perhaps she thought his lack of military reputation made him dependent on her. Perhaps she believed his education meant he shared her political vision. Perhaps she had so few acceptable choices that she accepted the danger. According to Procopius, Amalasuntha demanded solemn promises before raising Theodahad to the throne. He agreed that she would retain real authority and that he would serve as a partner rather than a rival. Publicly, the court presented their arrangement in glowing terms. Official letters praised Theodahad's wisdom, moderation, justice, and learning. The language now sounds painfully ironic. Behind the ceremony stood fear and mistrust. Amalasuntha needed him because she could not safely rule alone. Theodahad accepted because kingship gave him the opportunity to reverse old humiliations and settle old grievances. Once he possessed royal authority, the promises that had won him the crown became obstacles he could ignore. The betrayal began quickly. Theodahad reached out to the families of the nobles Amalasuntha had executed. They shared a common enemy. For them, the queen was responsible for the deaths of their relatives. For Theodahad, she was the person who had limited his property, controlled his rise, and expected him to remain subordinate. Together, they began to isolate her. Supporters loyal to Amalasuntha were removed. Some were killed. Others lost office or access to the court. The queen, who had once managed the kingdom through networks of administrators and diplomats, watched those networks collapse. She attempted to maintain contact with Constantinople, but Theodahad moved before imperial protection could arrive. Amalasuntha was arrested and taken away from Ravenna. Her destination was a fortress on an island in Lake Vulsina, known today as Lake Bolsena. The location was well chosen. Surrounded by water, the island could be guarded with relatively few men. Escape required a boat. Visitors could be monitored. Messages could be controlled. The distance from the royal capital separated Amalasuntha from officials who might rally around her. The island was a prison disguised as protective custody. Theodahad understood that openly killing her would be dangerous. She had communicated with Justinian and could claim imperial friendship. Constantinople might demand her release. To reduce the risk, he attempted to control the story. Roman senators were sent as envoys to explain that Amalasuntha was being treated well and had suffered no serious harm. She was forced to send a letter supporting this version, but the performance failed. One of the envoys, Liberius, reportedly told Justinian the truth. The queen had been stripped of power and imprisoned against her will. Justinian responded with anger and declared his support for her. This message changed the calculation. If Amalasuntha remained alive, she could become the center of a counter-revolution. Justinian could demand that she be restored. He could send agents or soldiers to rescue her. She could escape to Constantinople and return with imperial support. Theodahad's kingship would never be secure while the daughter of Theodoric lived and claimed that he had betrayed her. The island, therefore, became more than a prison. It became a place where Theodahad delayed a decision he increasingly believed he could not avoid. The relatives of the executed Gothic nobles demanded revenge. According to Procopius, they argued that Amalasuntha's survival threatened both them and the king. If Justinian restored her, she would punish those responsible for her imprisonment. If she escaped, their lives and property would be in danger. Theodahad had already demonstrated that his oaths meant little. Now he allowed the revenge faction to act. Whether he gave a direct order or simply surrendered the prisoner to her enemies, the political responsibility was his. Men were sent to the island. We do not know the exact number, the precise time of day, or the final words spoken inside the fortress. The most dramatic account comes from Jordanus, who wrote that Amalasuntha was strangled in her bath. This image has defined the story ever since. A queen, at her most vulnerable, attacked in a private chamber, the water of the bath surrounding her as assassins closed in. Procopius, in his public history of the Gothic War, gives a less detailed version. He says that the relatives of the men Amalasuntha had killed were allowed to remove her from the fortress and put her to death. His account emphasizes revenge and Theodahad's betrayal rather than the specific method. The difference matters. The bath scene may preserve a genuine tradition, but it cannot be treated with the same certainty as the fact of the murder itself. What we can confidently reconstruct is the structure of the crime. Amalasuntha had been isolated by Theodahad. Her enemies had access to her because he permitted it. She was killed in the spring of 535. Her death eliminated the most legitimate rival to the king. The murder was not a sudden act committed by strangers. It was the final stage of a political process. Loss of her son, forced partnership, removal of allies, arrest, imprisonment, diplomatic deception, and execution. Each stage narrowed her options until she stood alone on the island. The men who killed her may have believed they were avenging their families. Theodahad may have believed he was protecting his throne. Yet the crime solved nothing. It removed the person who had the strongest claim to continue Theodoric's political system, and it gave the most powerful emperor of the age a reason to intervene. Who truly ordered Amalasuntha's murder? The most straightforward answer is Theodahad. He had taken the crown through her support, betrayed the agreement that placed him on the throne, imprisoned her, and allowed her enemies to reach her. He benefited directly from her death. Jordanus describes the killers as his agents. Even if no surviving document preserves a formal command, he controlled the prisoner and the state. Nothing could have happened on the island without the consent of his government. Yet ancient accounts also emphasize the role of the revenge faction. The relatives of the executed nobles had personal motives that went beyond royal politics. They wanted blood for blood. They may have pressured Theodahad, frightening him with the possibility that Amalasuntha would return and destroy them all. If he was weak and indecisive, he may have allowed stronger personalities to determine the outcome. This interpretation does not absolve him. A king who hands a prisoner to known enemies is responsible for the predictable result. A third theory is more dramatic. In the secret history, a bitter and scandalous work attributed to Procopius, the Empress Theodora is accused of secretly arranging Amalasuntha's death. The story claims that Theodora feared the Gothic queen's beauty, status, or possible influence over Justinian and used an imperial envoy named Peter to encourage the murder. This version has fascinated later writers because it introduces a second powerful woman and transforms the case into an international palace conspiracy. But the accusation must be treated with great caution. The secret history is filled with extreme attacks on Justinian and Theodora. It presents them as corrupt, cruel, and almost demonic. Some information in the work may reflect real court gossip, but many stories are impossible to verify. More importantly, Procopius's public account of the Gothic War places responsibility on Theodahad and the Gothic enemies of Amalasuntha. It does not reveal an imperial plot. The claim that Theodora engineered the murder is therefore possible only as an unproven rumor preserved by a hostile source. The strongest conclusion remains that Theodahad enabled the crime and that a Gothic revenge faction carried it out. Theodora's alleged involvement adds mystery, but not certainty. When news of the murder reached Constantinople, Justinian reacted with public outrage. He had already communicated with Amalasuntha and could present her as a friend and ally of the Roman Empire. Her imprisonment had violated diplomatic expectations. Her murder could now be portrayed as an attack on lawful government and imperial honor. An envoy confronted Theodahad with a message that war would follow. Yet Justinian's motives were larger than personal anger. He had become emperor in 527 and pursued an ambitious vision of Roman power. The Eastern Roman Empire had survived the political collapse of the West and continued to call itself Roman. Constantinople possessed armies, wealth, law, and an imperial ideology that claimed authority over territories once governed from Rome. Justinian wanted to strengthen that claim. In 533 and 534, his general Belisarius had conquered the Vandal kingdom in North Africa with astonishing speed. The victory transformed the strategic balance of the Mediterranean. Imperial forces now controlled a base close to Sicily and Italy. Recovering Italy, especially Rome, would carry enormous symbolic value. It would also secure sea routes and extend imperial power across the central Mediterranean. Amalasuntha's murder therefore functioned as both a genuine grievance and a political opportunity. Justinian did not need to invent outrage. A queen who had sought his protection had been imprisoned and killed by the man she made king. But the emperor could also use the crime as a legal and moral justification for a campaign consistent with his wider ambitions. This distinction is important. The Gothic War did not begin solely because one woman died. Tensions between Constantinople and the Ostrogothic Kingdom already existed. Justinian had military momentum after the conquest of Africa. Italy was politically divided, and Theodahad appeared weak. The murder made intervention easier to explain. It allowed the emperor to present conquest as punishment, restoration, and justice. War could be described not as an invasion of a neighboring kingdom, but as the response of Roman authority to treachery and unlawful rule. In 535, Justinian launched operations against the Ostrogothic Kingdom. One imperial force moved into Dalmatia. Belisarius sailed toward Sicily. The island was strategically vital, rich in grain, and close to the newly conquered African territories. Gothic resistance there was limited. Sicily fell quickly. Theodahad, who had believed Amalasuntha's death would secure his position, now faced the empire's most successful general. His response revealed the weakness of his kingship. He negotiated, hesitated, and considered surrender. At moments, he appeared willing to abandon claims to Italy in exchange for wealth and safety. Then, changing military news encouraged him to reverse course. His indecision destroyed confidence among the Goths. A warrior aristocracy could forgive many faults in a king, but not cowardice during invasion. Imperial forces crossed into mainland Italy. Belisarius captured Naples after a difficult siege and moved north toward Rome. Gothic leaders removed Theodahad and chose Witiges, an experienced military commander, as king. Theodahad attempted to flee but was captured and killed in 536. His end came only a year after Amalasuntha's murder. The man who had betrayed her lost both throne and life. Yet the war did not end with him. It expanded into one of the most destructive conflicts in Italian history. Rome changed hands and endured prolonged siege. Aqueducts were cut. Food became scarce. Civilians suffered hunger, disease, displacement, and violence. Armies moved across farmland and damaged the economic systems that supported cities. The Ostrogoths continued resistance under several rulers. Belisarius captured Ravenna in 540, but Gothic power revived under Totila. The war entered new phases, drawing resources from across the empire. Justinian eventually sent the general Narses, who defeated the major Gothic armies in the early 550s. By the end, the Ostrogothic kingdom had been destroyed. Italy was formally restored to imperial control, but victory came at a terrible cost. Cities had been damaged, populations reduced, agriculture disrupted, and political stability weakened. New enemies would later enter the peninsula. The Roman reconquest recovered territory, while exhausting much of what made that territory valuable. The contrast is tragic. Amalasuntha had spent her political life trying to preserve the kingdom built by Theodoric. Her strategy was based on balance. Gothic warriors would retain military authority. Roman administrators would preserve civil order. The monarchy would respect the traditions of Italy while maintaining relations with Constantinople. Her policies were imperfect and often ruthless. She executed opponents, depended on palace networks, and may have underestimated the resentment caused by her cultural preferences. Yet her goal was continuity. The people who killed her claimed to defend Gothic interests or avenge Gothic nobles. Their action helped produce the opposite result. By removing Amalasuntha, they weakened the dynasty, placed the kingdom in the hands of an ineffective king, and gave Justinian the justification he needed to intervene. The murder did not single-handedly cause the Gothic War, but it accelerated a crisis and shaped the moral language of the invasion. Theodahad believed that a dead queen could no longer threaten him. He failed to understand that her death could become more powerful than her life. While alive, Amalasuntha was a vulnerable ruler with divided support. Once murdered, she became evidence of Gothic treachery, a symbol of violated legitimacy, and a diplomatic weapon in a Justinian's hands. Her gender also shaped the path to the island. Amalasuntha possessed education, royal blood, and years of governing experience, yet Gothic kingship was expected to be male and military. As Athalaric's regent, she could claim to defend her son's rights. After his death, she needed a male dynastic partner to make her rule acceptable. Theodahad was not more capable, but his gender and ancestry gave him political value. He used the legitimacy she granted him to destroy her. Her real danger was not the beauty or jealousy emphasized by later gossip. It was her claim to rule as Theodoric's daughter and her ability to seek support from Constantinople. The bath scene has survived because it captures the cruelty of the reversal. A queen once protected by ceremony left defenseless in a private chamber. Yet Jordanes alone supplies this detail, while Procopius confirms the murder without describing it in the same way. Neither writer witnessed the crime, and Amalasuntha's final words are unknown. The secure facts are already tragic. The man she elevated imprisoned her, her enemies gained access to the island, and the government attempted to conceal her mistreatment from Constantinople. Amalasuntha was not a powerless innocent. She governed in a violent political world, punished opponents, and ordered the deaths of nobles she believed threatened her. Their families wanted revenge, while other Gothic aristocrats feared her Roman officials and contacts with Constantinople. None of this justified her murder, but it explains the intensity of the conspiracy. The crime succeeded because several interests aligned. Theodahad wanted security, the revenge faction wanted vengeance, and opponents wanted an end to her political influence. Justinian then recognized the opportunity created by her death. Amalasuntha tried to protect herself through Theodahad's promises, but oaths had little value once her supporters could no longer enforce them. Official letters praised the new king's wisdom and moderation, while arrests and betrayal defined his real government. He accepted the crown by promising partnership, then ruled through imprisonment. By separating public language from private action, he destroyed the trust on which his authority depended. For Justinian, the murder supplied ideal political language. He could describe the invasion as punishment of a usurper and restoration of lawful government. That argument mattered to Roman subjects, senators, church leaders, and soldiers. Yet the Long War complicated any claim of rescue. Italy paid through siege, famine, taxation, and destruction. Theodahad died and imperial rule returned, but the political world Amalasuntha had tried to preserve was shattered. Amalasuntha's life stands at the turning point between Theodoric's stable kingdom and the destruction of Gothic Italy. She tried to govern through education, administration, and diplomacy, but her authority depended first on her father's legacy and then on her son. After Athalaric died, she chose a male partner to preserve her rule and instead gave Theodahad the position from which he could imprison her. The murder ended years of tension while beginning a much larger catastrophe. The safest historical judgment is therefore clear but carefully limited. Amalasuntha was murdered in 535 after being imprisoned by Theodahad on an island in Lake Vulsina. Relatives of Gothic nobles she had executed, participated in, or carried out the killing. Jordanes says she was strangled in her bath, while Procopius gives a less specific account. Theodahad was politically responsible because he betrayed her, controlled her imprisonment, and allowed her enemies to act. The claim that Empress Theodora secretly organized the murder is dramatic, but unproven, and comes from a deeply hostile source. Justinian used the Amalasuntha crime as a justification for war, but the invasion also served his broader project of Western reconquest. The Gothic War that followed destroyed the Ostrogothic Kingdom and devastated much of Italy. Beyond these points, certainty becomes harder. We cannot hear Amalasuntha's final words. We cannot know exactly what Theodahad said when he approved the action. We cannot measure how much of Justinian's outrage was personal and how much was strategic, but the consequences are visible. A queen trusted the wrong man. A king chose betrayal over partnership. Families turned grief into revenge. An emperor turned murder into war. The political system Theodoric had constructed could not survive the combination. Amalasuntha spent her reign trying to preserve a kingdom built between two worlds. She believed that Roman education and Gothic strength could coexist. She believed that diplomacy could protect Italy from the ambitions of Constantinople. She believed that royal blood, careful agreements, and political intelligence could compensate for the fact that she was a woman ruling among warrior nobles. For a time, she succeeded. She governed in her son's name, worked with Roman administrators, and maintained the structure left by Theodoric. But the death of Athalaric removed the shield protecting her authority. Her choice of Theodahad was meant to save her position. Instead, it created the instrument of her destruction. On the island, surrounded by water and guarded by men loyal to her enemies, the queen finally faced the full cost of that decision. Her murder was intended to secure a throne. It did the opposite. Theodahad's reign collapsed. Justinian invaded. Italy descended into war. The Ostrogothic kingdom disappeared. In the end, almost everyone involved tried to use Amalasuntha for a political purpose. The Gothic nobles used her death as revenge. Theodahad used it as a means of removing a rival. Justinian used it as a reason for conquest. Later writers used it to condemn greed, weakness, female ambition, imperial cruelty, or barbarian treachery. Yet behind all these interpretations stood a woman who had spent years performing the difficult work of government. She was not simply the queen murdered in her bath. She was the ruler who tried to hold together the Roman and Gothic worlds after Theodoric, and whose destruction helped tear those worlds apart. Her death on a lonely island did not end a crisis. It released one. The crime that was supposed to protect the Ostrogothic throne became the justification for the war that destroyed it. And that is why the murder of Amalasuntha remains one of the most consequential royal